I didn't want to play those other videos that we sometimes see because it kind of gives the whole story away, and I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about Esther. Probably one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, although I've found myself saying that kind of a lot as we've been going through the story. Over the last several weeks or several months, really, as we've been covering all of the Bible, starting in Genesis all the way through, we in the last several weeks have really been dealing with what's the period called the exile. This is the time where the Jews have been taken captive. The first 10 tribes, Israel, has been taken into captivity by Assyria. They're never to be seen again. Judah, the last two tribes, Judah, have been taken into captivity by Babylon. We've watched Daniel has been in that period of time, and some of those other favorite stories that we have been in that period of time. But Babylon is no more. They've been overtaken by the Persians, the Persian Empire, and they've emerged on the world stage as kind of the dominant superpower of their time. Now, the Persian kings ruled a bit differently than the Babylonian kings did. The Persians preferred to keep a lighter hand on the way things were run and just a heavier taxation. They wanted to make sure they were getting their piece of things, but they weren't quite so intent on dominating the people. They allowed the Jews to return home and rebuild the temple. We saw that. We talked about that last week. About 50,000 of the Jews, those remainders of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, have been allowed to go back, and so we've seen that just this last week. Now, we also know that not all of the Jews went back to Israel with that first group. There's maybe some uncertainty about the long journey and about what they're going to find when they get there, and maybe there's some concern about all the amount of work that needs to be done when they get there to begin the rebuilding process. Some of them had just simply made a life for themselves here in what's now Persia. They've got homes and businesses and families, and they don't really see anything necessarily to go back to in the land that they came from in Israel. Many of them have just simply assimilated into the Persian culture, but for a variety of reasons, a number of the Jews simply do not return to Israel, at least not at this time. Now, one of those that doesn't return is a young girl by the name of Hadassah. That's her Jewish name. You're probably more familiar with her by her Persian name, which is Esther. Esther is an orphan. She's been orphaned while she's in captivity. Her parents have died, and she's been adopted by an older cousin, a cousin named Mordecai. Now, Mordecai and Esther live in one of the capital cities. Persia has several capital cities, but in a capital city known as Susa, which is right here, kind of in the middle of this map. Now, the Persian Empire goes from all the way over here to India, down into Egypt and Ethiopia in this area, and they've really started making some inroads into Greece, even to the north there. So they're really the very dominant power at this time. But Mordecai and Esther live in Susa, in this capital city. This is where King Xerxes is most of the time. Now, we haven't run into Xerxes yet. He's actually the grandfather of a man named Cyrus. We've talked about him a little bit so far. Cyrus is the king who overthrew the Babylonian Empire and made it a Persian Empire. At the end of Daniel's life, when he was there when that happened, and so he served Cyrus for the first couple years of Cyrus's reign anyway. Cyrus is the king who'd issued the decrees sending the Jews back to Jerusalem and authorizing them to rebuild their temple. It's going to be Cyrus's son Darius, this is Xerxes' father, who is the one who, if you remember from last week, who's the one that told the people, the enemies of Judah, that you have to finance this rebuilding of the temple. So that gives us a bit of the background there. And next week we'll actually be talking about Xerxes' son, who is going to be the one who authorizes Nehemiah to go back and finish rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, so just a bit of the biblical perspective of what's going on there. Now, it's true that the Persians have been somewhat kind, I guess, to the Jews. I think that might even be an overstatement. They've been gracious. We'll say that they've been gracious. They've allowed them to do things. They haven't ruled it over them. But I don't think that we can take that to mean that the Persians or the Persian kings are nice people. Let me tell you just a little bit about Xerxes. It's in the third year of his reign, and he throws a giant party in Susa and actually throughout the whole empire. And everybody that's anybody is invited to this party, especially that are brought into Susa, into this capital city. All of his military leaders are there, any of the nobility and the princes, all of the officials, really anybody who's got any status is here in Susa for this 6-month-long party. And it's extravagant. If you can, you just have to imagine what it would look like. But the festivities that are taking place there, this whole time that's going on, just the decorations and the extravagance. Xerxes is really in this whole situation just simply trying to show everybody how wealthy and powerful that he is. This party is really all about Xerxes. And when the 6-month party is over, well, he decides to just kind of cap it all off with a 7-day long, a 1-week-long party celebrating the party. I mean, even over the top of what the rest of that party looked like. See, Xerxes has hundreds, if not thousands, of guests there, all of these prominent people, and every one of them has a gold goblet to drink from, and every one of them has been handcrafted, and none of these goblets look the same as anyone else's goblets. Wine is flowing freely. This is maybe a little bit unusual in this time where the king would actually, or maybe there'd be a toastmaster, if you're familiar with that term, who would actually tell the people when to drink and what to drink, but that's not taking place. It's just whatever you want, whenever you want, drink as much as you want. That's this nature of the 7 days that follow the 6-month party. There's no expense that's spared in this party. If you want to think of it kind of more like a frat party, I think is what would probably give you an idea of what that would look like. See, there's no concern with people's behavior. There's no such thing as excess. Excess is the norm in this situation. Okay, so we get to the last day of this 7-day party on top of a party, and we'll read this in Esther chapter 1, verse 10, if you want to go ahead and turn there. And this will be on page 276 of the story. We read this: On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him. He commanded them to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. And the king became furious and burned with anger. See, after spending all of this time displaying his power and his authority and his wealth for everyone to see, well, Xerxes wants to top it off with that one thing that he hasn't shown off yet, that he hasn't exhibited, his trophy wife, Vashti. Now, Jewish tradition actually says that when he commanded her to show up in her royal crown, that what he was commanding is that she would show up in only her royal crown. That's a possibility. I don't know if that's true, but whatever it was, whether that's the case or not, Xerxes was clearly looking to objectify her, to make her, to show her as a possession, as something valuable that he possesses and owns, this incredibly attractive woman. Well, rightly so, I think that Vashti refuses this command. She doesn't want to be paraded in front of all of his drunken frat buddies to be shown as an object. Now, we'll talk about the courage of Esther in a few moments, but I do think we should maybe just stop for just a half a second and consider the courage of this woman who would refuse the order of the king, not knowing what's going to happen. Well, it's pretty obvious that Xerxes' advisors are all men because they're concerned with this display from the queen, and really their concern comes down to this. They say, if the queen's not punished, well, all of our wives and all the women in the nation will believe that they can disobey their husbands too. So you need to make an example out of her. You need to do something about this woman. Now, he follows their advice, and Vashti is deposed. We don't really know what happens to her, whether she was killed, whether she went into obscurity in the harem, whether she was divorced and sent off to the four corners of the world. Nobody knows what happened to her. But here's what we see when Xerxes has had a little bit of time to cool off a little bit, to kind of think about, well, the fact that he no longer has a queen. In Esther chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, we're going to read this. The king's personal attendant proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now, like every young woman, no doubt Esther has dreams about what her future is going to look like. She probably dreams of settling down with a nice Jewish boy, raising a family, maybe sending them to Hebrew school, taking a vacation every year on the coast. A pretty normal dream, I would imagine, is what this young orphan girl has in mind for what her future looks like. Esther's dreams, though, are not going to come true. See, the problem is that Esther is extraordinarily beautiful, and against her will, she's swept up by the king's commissioners, these people that are looking for the beautiful women in the kingdom, and she's deposited into the harem, into the king's harem. In all likelihood, what her future now looks like is to have her body used for one night and then to be discarded to a life of regret, a life that's tarnished by bitterness and loneliness. Maybe a life just thinking about those dreams that never came to be. Some of you are probably living a life that you didn't choose. You never dreamed that your husband would abandon you. You never dreamed that your wife would constantly emasculate you and ridicule you. You never dreamed that you'd end up working that dead-end job day after day and week after week and year after year. You never considered cancer. Addiction, that was never on your bucket list. You did not choose to be unemployed or in poverty. Some of you may even look back on the choices that you've made. If only I'd been more patient with my kids. If only I'd never taken that first drink. If only I'd waited until I was married. If only I'd waited for the right partner instead of settling for right now. If only I'd gone to college, or if I'd chosen a different major. If only I'd been dealt a better hand by life. Maybe you find yourself like Esther, dreaming about what might have been. Let's go ahead and put a pin in that for a moment. We'll come back to it in a little while. The most beautiful young women through all of the kingdom of Persia that we were just looking at, this vast empire, they're all taken to the city of Susa. Come from Africa, from India, from Southwest Asia, from Greece, and everywhere in between. Now, if only one of them were brought from each of the provinces of Xerxes, of the Persian Empire, there would have been 127 of them. I think that there were lots more. I don't think that it was boiled down to one per province. And I don't know how long it is before Xerxes decides, between the time that he deposes Vashti and the time that he decides that he needs a new queen, but I don't think it took very long. Ladies, show of hands, how many of you have ever spent more than, let's say, an hour getting ready for a hot date? How many of you ever spent more than 2 hours? Anybody ever spent more time than the actual date lasted? These young women are preparing for 12 months for their one chance to make an impression on the king. I think they spent part of their day with cardio kickboxing and P90X. I think that they spent time in the sauna and they learned how to sing and to play instruments. I think they learned how to use a fork and which fork to use with which course of the meal, which was a salad fork and which was your meat fork and your hors d'oeuvre fork. I think they learned how to drink tea with their little finger, extended in the right proper way, or to walk around with a book on their head, get that'll sway to the hips. And I'm not going to try and demonstrate that, but the poise that that a young woman would have. They spent 12 months trying to figure all this out. They learned cosmetics. They learned how to style their hair. Maybe some of them learned to juggle, I don't know. But they have one chance to make an impression on the king. Maybe if there's any kind of a similarity, maybe some of you spent some time prior to your wedding getting ready, maybe trying to make sure that dress looked just right on you. But I would dare to say that you probably didn't devote every waking minute of the day for that time preparing for what you might look like on that one day. But that's where these young women are. All across the realm, these women have been gathered. and they're preparing for their one chance, their one interaction with the king. Well, day after day, Mordecai, Esther's adopted father, her cousin, he comes to the courtyard of the harem, and he's just really coming to check on how Esther is doing. Night after night, another young woman is led off into the king's presence, and in the morning she comes back and she goes into a separate part of the harem that's designated for the king's concubines. And almost all of them probably never see the king again. The scripture tells us that they would only return to him if he asked for them by name. It's been 5 years since Vashti's been deposed, and finally Esther's turn comes. It's her turn to spend a night with the king. And there's something about Esther that catches the king's attention. And she becomes now Queen Esther. He's found his replacement for Vashti. He's found the woman who's to be his king. See, Esther's situation has changed. She's not going to be cast off after all. She's not going to be used once and then have to settle for a life of obscurity, a future without any kind of prominence. In fact, she is going to be the most prominent woman in the empire. She'll be looked at by everyone. And maybe when I was talking a few moments ago, you didn't relate to that first example of what it might look like to be Esther. See, maybe you're living the life that Esther actually ended up with. Maybe you have that doting husband that just is attentive to every need that you have. He's romantic. He makes good money. He buys you everything that your heart desires. He takes you on extravagant vacations wherever and whenever you want to go. Or maybe you're a man and you're working your dream job, or maybe you even own your own company. You make your own hours, you're making good money, you've got a sports car and a boat in the garage, you've got a giant screen TV in your man cave. Your wife adores you, your kids love you and they respect you, your employees admire you. Maybe your kids they're getting good grades in school and they've already been accepted to prominent colleges. Maybe you never even think about what might have been because you're living your dream right now. And maybe like Esther, you're content to just live that dream, to just remain where you are in that pleasant situation. But like for Esther, maybe that's not all that your future has in store for you. So far we've talked about 3 of the main characters that take place in this story, but there's a 4th. So we've talked about Esther, we've talked about Xerxes, and we've talked about Mordecai. But there's this other man that we haven't met yet. His name is Haman. Haman is the descendant of one of the, he comes from one of the nations that Israel had really annihilated way back in the future, and he hates the Jews. He hates one particular Jew in particular. He loathes Mordecai. Well, Haman is elevated to a position as the chief of staff for Xerxes. He's the second in command. See, Mordecai at this time, he's only really a minor official to Xerxes, and custom would dictate, and the command actually is that Mordecai, when Haman passes by, Mordecai is required to bow to him, just like everybody else does, but Mordecai refuses. And this really, really makes Haman angry. But rather than seeking to kill just Mordecai, Haman hatches a plot that he's going to actually wipe out the entire Jewish nation, every Jew that lives in Persia, which really is pretty much every Jew that's left in the world. And so he approaches Xerxes with a proposal, and he says, "Hey, there's this people that they're kind of rebellious. They're not good people. They're problems, and we really need to take care of them. We need to wipe them out. And as a good loyal subject, Your Majesty, I'm going to go ahead and take care of any of the expense that's involved in that. I'm going to finance the whole operation." Xerxes is completely indifferent to the details. He doesn't care. He rules a vast empire, and wiping out one nation, one group of people is no concern at all. And so he gives Haman his signet ring, and he says, "Do what you want, and you can even keep your money. I'm not worried about that." Well, Haman casts lots. He basically rolls the dice, is what that means. And he determines what day it is that will be the day that he exacts his evil plot, that he has all the Jews killed, all the men, the women, and the children. He's intending to wipe them all out. And it falls to the 11th month. This is when it's going to occur in 11 months. It's the last month of the year. But in 11 months is when this thing is going to take place. One day out of the year, and all of these Jews are going to be killed. And to make it just a little bit more attractive for people that might have a little bit of hesitance to commit murder, he just says, any of the Jews that you kill, well, you can keep their stuff. So you can keep the plunder. Now, as you can imagine, when Mordecai hears this news, he's distraught. He sends word to Esther and he tells her, you need to let the king know what's happening. You need to tell your husband, you need to beg your husband for relief. You need to go to your husband and somehow find a way to find mercy for us. And Esther wants to go. She wants to do that, but there's a problem. See, anyone, even the queen, anybody that approaches the king without being called by the king, it's an automatic death sentence. And the only way out of that is the king is in a particularly good mood that day, and he extends his royal scepter to you. And if he does that, then your sentence of death is commuted. But otherwise, you're automatically to be killed. Esther's been queen for 5 years by this time, and it appears, we'll see later, that it appears that Xerxes has some affection for her. But it seems also like his passion for her has waned to some degree. He's not exactly a devoted husband. He's a king with a giant harem, and she informs Mordecai that, by the way, I haven't seen him for 30 days, and I don't know when the next time is that I would see him. And if I'm to go into his presence, it's likely that I'll die. We'll read Mordecai's response in Esther chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. This will be on page 282 of your story. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think because you are in the king's house that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When it is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Well, that's what happens. She waits that 3 days and she goes to the king. And fortunately, he's happy to see her. He has some kind of affection towards her. And so he holds out his scepter and he says, what can I do for you, Queen Esther? Up to half of my kingdom I'll give you. Just name it. What is it I can do for you? Now, you need to understand when a king makes an offer like this, he's really not offering half of his kingdom. It's kind of the royal equivalent of saying, you can use the remote tonight. You can be in charge of what we watch. It's not a literal offer, but Esther simply invites him. She says, look, all I really want is just some alone time, maybe just the two of us. We could have dinner together. But why don't you go ahead and bring Haman? Bring your chief of staff anyway, and let's just have dinner. And the king says, that sounds nice, and let's do that. So they have dinner together. Xerxes and Haman attend this private banquet. And Xerxes, he's pleased with Esther. He's affectionate for her. And so he says, okay, now tell me what it is that you want. What can I do for you? Again, up to half of my kingdom. Maybe a little bit more than the remote control at this point. He's enticed, right? There's something about a mysterious woman. And so he's interested and he wants to know what's going on. And she says, look, if you could maybe just come back for dinner tomorrow, just you and Haman, just a private little banquet for the three of us. He says, okay, all right, we'll do that. I'm intrigued. I want to know about this. She says, I'll tell you tomorrow what it is that you can do for me. Well, Haman leaves this banquet, this dinner, this private dinner, and he's feeling incredibly honored. He's walking on air. He's the king's right-hand man. He's the only person that's been invited to this banquet between the king and the queen. He's got to be walking around thinking, I'm all that, right? And he's on cloud nine. He's walking on air, and he walks out the king's gate, and there's Mordecai. And Mordecai does this. Nothing. He doesn't bow. He doesn't pay him honor. And that just wrecks Haman's whole night. And so what was an amazing night, he goes home and he's just storming off. He's mad. He calls all his friends together. He calls his wife together. And he brags. He spends the whole evening kind of talking about how great he is, his wealth, the number of his kids, how he's been honored by the king, how he's been honored to be invited to this banquet by the queen. And he says, and really none of that means anything because this Jew Mordecai, who doesn't bow to me like he's supposed to. In my life, I just can't go on with my life unless something's done about this. And they give him a little bit of advice. They say, well, why don't you deal with him? Let's tell you what, let's put up a 50 cubit, 75 feet. I'm thinking that the ceiling in here is probably 25, 30 feet, so triple that. Let's erect a pole in our yard that's 75 feet tall. And in the morning, why don't you talk to the king and just say, hey, I want to have this guy impaled on this pole. And Haman says, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. I don't need to wait until the 12th month when all the rest of the Jews are killed. I'm going to take care of this Mordecai right now. And so nobody sleeps in Haman's house that night. Nobody sleeps because there's banging and racket, and they're all out there trying to erect this giant pole. I don't know what the logistics of that looked like, but it must have been something to see. Well, somebody else can't sleep that night. See, Xerxes isn't sleeping that night either. And so most of you, when you can't sleep, you grab your phone and you play Angry Birds or something like that. But smartphones hadn't been invented then, and so he does the next best thing, and he calls for his historians, and he says, hey, if anything's going to put me to sleep, let's get some history. And his historians come in and they begin to read him of his court, his exploits, the things that he's done. They read to him about himself, because what else would a king want to hear about other than himself? And as they're reading to him, they come across this event that took place, that an assassination attempt had been attempted. Oddly enough, there was an assassination attempt against his life, and it was thwarted by a man named Mordecai, who heard about it. He told the king. They investigated. They found that it was true, and so they had killed those conspirators. And Xerxes starts to think about it. And he's like, "What did we ever do for that guy that saved my life? That stopped this assassination plot?" And nothing's been done. And so he lays there a little while, and he's thinking, what can we do for somebody like this? Well, Haman comes in the morning. He shows up for work. And the king calls him into his chambers, and he says, hey, Haman, I've been thinking, and I'd like to know what it is that the king can do for someone that he wants to honor. Well, you can imagine if you're Haman, you're thinking, man, everything's going my way. Who else could he be talking about except me? The king wants to honor me, and so let me think. What would I want the king to do for me? He says, maybe put a royal robe on this person, a robe that you have worn yourself, your majesty. Put this robe on him to honor him. And on top of that, put him on a horse that you've ridden, one of your own private horses. Put the king's crest on that horse. And take one of the most noble princes, one of the most the highest officials in the kingdom, and have them walk through the streets leading this horse with the man on it, saying, this is what the king does for the man that he wants to honor. The man that the king is delighted in. And Haman sets this all up, and Xerxes thinks about it, and he says, that's a great idea. Now, if you've ever watched a movie where you kind of get that slow motion, like something's happening, that punch to the face, that slow motion, right? Well, I think that's kind of what happens. See, Haman's thinking, okay, I'm going to go get this ready, and the king says, do all this for Mordecai. You can just imagine the slow motion punch that Haman takes. Well, he does it. He doesn't have a choice. He goes and he leads Mordecai throughout the city, calling out, this is what is done for the man that the king wants to honor. And he finally gets back to the stables, and he drops the horse off there, and the grooms do the rest of what they do. And he goes home, and he's fuming. He's humiliated. He's embarrassed. He's angry. And he gets home and he tells his wife, he cries to his wife again and his friends, and he's like, this horrible thing's happened today. And before he can even change his clothes and get the smell of horse off of him, the limo pulls up, right, to take him to this royal banquet. And so he goes to the banquet with the king and the queen, and he's maybe feeling like, okay, I mean, at least a good end for a bad day, right? So they have a nice dinner. Everything seems to go well. Couple glasses of wine, and the king finally says, okay, now really, Esther, this time I want to know, what is it that I can do for you? We'll find the answer to that on page 285 of the story. This is in Esther chapter 7, starting in verse 3. And Queen Esther answered, "If I've found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we'd been merely sold to be sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who's dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." I don't know if you can picture Haman's face at this point. The bad end of a bad day. I think that we need to really, we don't have much time left, so I need to wrap this up. So let me just give you kind of the summary of the end of the story. Haman is impaled on the same pole in his own yard that he'd set up to have Mordecai killed on. Haman's estate is given to Esther, and Esther gives it to Mordecai to manage this estate for her. Mordecai, at Esther's suggestion, is elevated to this new position that's been vacated by Haman. He's now the chief of staff. He's the second in command. Although the original extermination order can't be rescinded, if you remember, we've talked about this in the past, that when a Persian king puts something into writing, it can't be rescinded. Well, Mordecai is given Haman's power, he's given the ring, and he's given permission to find a way around this decree that's been issued previously. And so he does. He says, okay, this thing is still going to happen on this 13th day of the last month. It's still going to happen that people are going to try to kill the Jews, but Jews, you can defend yourself. And it's obvious that this is the king's intention, that the Jews be saved. And so all of the people who may have been inclined to, maybe on the fence, inclined to go after the Jews, well, they end up supporting the Jews. And the Jews are allowed to and even able to defeat any of those that would actually come against them. 75,000, just a little over 75,000 of the Jewish enemies are killed on this final day when that all came about. The Jews celebrate this event the following day. They institute a feast called the Feast of Purim, and this feast is still celebrated to this day by Jews. Now, I wish we had more time, because there is a lot more to this story, more details that we just don't have time to talk about. But I want to point out something that you may possibly have missed when you were reading this story. See, there's a fifth character that takes place in this story. And while God is never mentioned in the book of Esther at all, even when Esther is talking about fasting, there's no mention of prayer, there's no mention of God anywhere. Well, that doesn't mean that God is absent from this story. In fact, God is the main character in this story. In this story of Esther, like in your story, God's just behind the scenes. You can't see Him. He's the main character of the story. Otherwise, how is it that you can put all of these things together in the way that they come about? How is it all the people in the vast empire of the Persians, of all of those people, a Jewish orphan becomes queen? And how is it that Mordecai is the one that saves the king from assassination? How is it that the king would have insomnia on the exact night that Haman is plotting his death? How is it that the king would have read to him that exact story of Mordecai's saving him from assassination? How is it that Haman would be caught in his own trap and face his own death penalty? How is it that Haman's intended victim takes Haman's place in the palace, takes his place as this chief of staff, this prime minister, this second in command? How is it that the king's ring ends up no longer on Haman's finger, but on Mordecai's finger? How is it the people that have marked the Jews for destruction have themselves been destroyed instead? The story of Esther is really riddled with situations that the world would call coincidence. It's not a coincidence, though. See, God is acting in the life of Esther, and He's acting in your life as well. God has plans for you, and probably bigger plans than you might imagine. Maybe life hasn't turned out the way that you dreamed it would, but God has something for you to do and something to do right where you are. Maybe like Esther, life actually turned out better than you had anticipated that it was going to. You're content to remain in your comfortable situation and just go with the flow. If I can be vulnerable for a moment, I'm going to tell you something. I want to do big things. I want to do big things for the kingdom of God. And I don't know what that might look like. I don't know if I'm going to be the next Billy Graham or Francis Chan. It's doubtful. But God's got plans for my life. Maybe I'm just the guy that leads the next Billy Graham to the Lord. Maybe that's my role. I don't know what that role looks like. But I want big things for the kingdom. I want to do big things. I want God to use me in big ways. Maybe God has something entirely different for me to do. I don't know. I think He has something big for you to do as well. You may know what that is, you may not. But I think what it requires of us is the ability and the willingness to say, if I perish, I perish. I'm going to do what He's asking me to do, regardless of the consequences. See, I would ask you the same thing that Mordecai said to Esther. He says, who knows but you have come to your current position for such a time as this? I think it's a safe bet that God's put you in the position you're in now for such a time as this. And I don't know what that such a time as this means in your particular case, in your life. In your parenting, God has something big for you to do. In your workplace, God has something big for you to do. In your addiction and in your failure and in your brokenness, your poverty, God has something big for you to do. In your success, in your comfort, in your wealth, God has something big for you to do too. So Esther had a decision to make. Mordecai told her that if you don't do this, deliverance will come for the Jews from somewhere else. But you're going to miss out on your part in it. See, God will accomplish His purpose. I guess we just have to decide if we're going to be an Esther who gets on board with that purpose or a Haman who God uses in a totally different way. Are you willing to miss out on what God has for you, on the bigness that He has for you? Who knows but that you've come to your position, to where you are right now for such a time as this. I'm going to invite our worship team to come back up. They're going to lead us in a song as we sing, as we take our communion. And I would encourage you to sing along as we sing this song. This is the time of our service where we remember, see, God's got this plan, and God's saving His nation, and He's doing that for a reason. And we've been talking about this throughout this entire series, that someone is coming. Someone is coming, and we're actually going to get to that someone in 2 more weeks. We've got 1 more week in the Old Testament, and we'll get to the climax of this story in just 2 more weeks from now. But this someone is coming. This someone that came. This someone came and He died, and He sacrificed Himself for you and for me to restore that relationship that was broken all the way back in chapter 1. And so when we take communion, we remember that. We remember the broken body, and we take that little piece of bread. And we remember the broken body, and we take that little cup of juice, and we remember His shed blood. And so as we sing this song, as you sing this song with us, as you feel ready, there's 5 tables around the outside of the auditorium, and you can go and you can take that communion, take it with your family. If you prefer to do it that way, you can stand there and take it. You can bring it back to your seats and take it. You're free to take that however is best for you. But sing with us, take that communion, and then I'll have just a final couple thoughts for you in just a few moments.